Good morning. And let me first congratulate you. Norway can build its economy on a very highly skilled labor force by international comparisons. And that's in large part because Norwegians' place of work have always been places of learning. And that's so important these days. We used to learn to do the work, and now learning has become the work. But let me also tell you that you may need to work a lot harder to maintain that advantage in the future. One of the things we do at the OECD is we track the quality of skills, and we track that in early ages and later in life. And let me just talk a little bit about the beginning of people's life through our PISA comparisons, the age of 50. 2006, we started to look at whether young people can think like a scientist, something that's very important in today's economy. Now, 2006 is a long time ago for most of us. It's very hard to remember those times. It was a year before the iPhone was invented. We didn't have smartphones. Twitter was still a sound. The Amazon still a river. In those days, many of the technologies we take for granted did not exist. But when you look at education in Norway, yes, outcomes improved slightly, but the world changed very fast. And the world didn't stop in 2009. Remember, maps became dynamic. Cars started to drive electric, actually, even without a driver. 2011, the first driverless car. But you can see education is not keeping up with those changes. And if you just think in a period 2012 to 2015, robotics, cloud computing, biogenetics, big data, huge changes in the world of science and technology, and education isn't keeping up. The gap between what our societies demand from young people today and what education systems produce is not becoming smaller, it's becoming wider. And that's not a story about Norway alone. You can see, you look at the United States, another country, very same kind of trend, flattening of educational development. But there's some countries that have bucked that trend. Who would have thought in 2006 that poor Portugal, despite the financial crisis, would actually move up to skill levels that you took for granted in Norway. Or you can look to Singapore, moving from good to great, and some regions in China I can barely put on a map. The world is changing fast. It's hard to keep up. And if you think about technology in the years to come, digitalization is incredibly democratizing. Everybody can collaborate, everybody can participate. But it's also concentrating power at a rate we've never seen before. Digitalization is incredibly particularizing. The smallest voice can be heard everywhere. You post something on Twitter and the world can follow you. But it's also incredibly homogenizing, squashing individual differences, cultural uniqueness. The questions around identity become more and more important. Technology is incredibly empowering, and nobody knows that better than you. The most successful companies in Norway are not created by a big industry, but by a big idea. They have the product before they have the money. That is what technology allows us to do. But technology can also be incredibly disempowering. When we become the slaves of algorithms who tell us, whether to turn left or right, and things like this. And where you end up on this map has a lot to do with the investments you make today in the skills of people. Think about the new firm, the platform economy. A very small company can have a huge footprint today. We no longer know what it actually means when you talk about a small or a big firm. You no longer know who's the customer and who is the business. All of those things become integrated in a very fast-changing world. And when you look at the skills, we are seeing a decline in routine skills. The kind of things that are easy to teach, easy to test, are suddenly disappearing. We're seeing a rise in technology-intensive industries. And you put the things together, and we have a pretty clear idea what the future of work really looks like. In terms of data, once again, there's been a small decline in manual skills. Robots are taking over a whole factory, but the steepest decline is not in manual skills. It's actually in routine cognitive skills. Filling people up with knowledge and expecting that's going to help them throughout their life. That no longer works. Look at the blue line. What we are seeing is a rise in the capacity of people, to solve complex problems, to think creatively, to imagine, to create. to manage and resolve tensions and dilemmas. Those are the kind of skills that are rising in demand. And the green line, social skills. We take that for granted. We talk a lot about but then, at the end of the day, we put students behind individual desks and test whether they are better than the neighbor. So there's a big gap between what the world requires and what we produce. Coming back to firms, what we see very clearly is that when you work in a digital-intensive industry, you're much better in extracting value from the skills of people. And that's good for your enterprise, and it's also great for people. Now, they get higher wages. You can see that very clear. And this is not just about technology skills. You can see that almost any skill category in a technology-intensive industry is bearing more fruit. You can see that you're more likely to learn from your co-workers. Now, that's also very important. Today is not going to an institution or university. Learning is happening where you work. And you're more likely to learn by doing. You're more likely to keep up to date if you work in a technology-intensive kind of sector. And I'm saying this because many people are afraid, technology is going to steal jobs from people. Actually, that is not at all clear. Technology may create a lot of more productive work and make our lives a lot more interesting. You can see that also over time. Now, this is one of the most interesting findings from our survey of adult skills. If you work in a digital environment, actually, throughout your life, at least for the first 20 years in your work, you're pretty good in maintaining the skills you get when you learn early on. If you work in a more traditional kind of sector, actually, you lose a lot of skills because you're not using them well. Actually, this is very important as well. Developing skills is about making good use out of your skills. If your employer is not very good in extracting value from your skills, it's also bad for you. Now, where do countries stand on this? First, let's start with the older population. This is about problem-solving skills in a digital environment. I'm talking about 55 to 64-year-olds. You can see the United States is doing pretty well. New Zealand, Norway also quite well. In the older generation, again, the stock of skills is quite good, but we're only talking about 1 in 10 to 1 in 5 older workers being ready for today's flat world. Think about this. Many people in the workforce are not ready even for today's world, not to speak of tomorrow's. And I know you're not going to tell me, well, that's all solved for the younger generation. They're all digital natives. They can do all of those kind of things. And yes, the bars get longer in the younger generation when you talk about 16 to 24-year-olds. But again, you're only talking on average around every second young person being prepared for the world in which we live today. That may be hard for you to believe because the people around you probably are all highly skilled in a technology environment. But go out on the street. Every second young person you meet is not ready for the world in which we live. But look also how this has changed. I said United States was doing really well in the past. If you look at the young population, they're at the bottom of the league. Not because things go worse, but because things got so much faster, better elsewhere. And you look to Singapore, one of the poorest performers among older adults, now at the top of the league. Huge investments in the skills of people. Now, what does this mean in practice? Let's look at an occupation that we all know, truck drivers. If nothing happens, demand is going to go up. We are sending more and more parcels and things like this. But, we all know that we can automate those jobs today. We could do this today. No, we have the technology. Let's imagine, in 10 years' time, it's becoming a reality. The demand for truck drivers could dramatically decline. You're talking about, in Europe, about, 2 million jobs. In the United States, 1.5 million jobs. Huge number of jobs actually being disappearing by technology. What are we doing today to invest in the skills of those people to keep up today, to prepare for the next job? Some people have called this a race between education and technology. Before the first industrial revolution, neither technology nor education had a big impact for the most of people's lives. But then came the industrial revolution, moving technology ahead of people and actually in those times creating huge amount of social pain. You wouldn't have wanted to live in those days. But, then we invented, schooling. We put people, we made people compliant with the norms of the industrial kind of industries. And that was actually a very good thing to do that allowed us to move people ahead of technology. But if we're honest, we haven't changed that model since those times. We are still following a very industrial way of education in those days. And we are seeing now the digital revolution. Putting, again, technology ahead of people. And we are seeing the same phenomenon. University graduates, having difficulties finding a job, and at the same time, you tell that you can't find the people with the skills you need. No? That is the problem of our time. So the question really is, how can we avoid that social pain and move people once again ahead of the technologies of their times? No? Now, the first thing people talk about is money. No? And actually, I'm always impressed. You're in Norway, even before you speak about, having a problem, there's someone writing a check. There's a lot of money being invested in education. But that always gets you only so far. You can actually see, you look at the PISA outcomes. For very poor countries, money is a good predictor for becoming better. For countries like Norway, matters a lot more how you're going to invest that money. Time, same picture. No? There are huge amounts of differences in the time people spend in schooling and university. No? Look at the United Arab Emirates, almost 60 hours learning in school or learning out of school. No? In Finland, your neighbor, it's just about a little bit more than half than that. No? Huge differences in the volume of learning time. But when you look at productivity, you can see that in Finland or Germany or Switzerland, Japan, students learn a lot in very little time, and in the United Arab Emirates, they spend a lot of time and learn very little. No? So it's not so easy about time and money. It's a lot more, how we build the kind of lifelong, life-wide culture for learning. No? This is a tradition. We go to school, we go to university, we work somewhere, and then suddenly we retire. No? The future, we all know, is looking like this. No? Investment in the very early years is hugely more important. Early childhood education and care. Many of the skills that you value most as employers are not developed in school and universities. No? Social emotional skills, character skills, employability skills. It's the early years. When you think about resilience, emotional control, empathy. No? We take them as character qualities or personality traits. They're actually skills. So early years will become hugely important. Tertiary education, no? Well connected to jobs. And then again, upskilling and reskilling is really the key for people's learning. When you look at how countries stack up on this, you can say actually in the older generation, actually Norway is very well positioned. That's the red dot. Again, you are very good as employers to provide good places of learning. But you look at the younger cohort, Norway is no longer special. Most parts of the industrial world now do as good a job as Norway in providing places of learning for young people. And I think that's really, really important. We also, let me just skip that. We also see that when you look at the investments that you make in the skills of people as employers, you tend to invest in the green people, people with high skills. Very natural. These are the people that are most promising. No? That's where investment goes. But actually, those people who are poorly skilled, they also get some resources, but much less. No? So actually, adult learning, as we know it today, is not moderating skill differences that come, from initial education. It's reinforcing them. Closing the gap is very different. And the most disappointing slide, unfortunately I have no data for Norway here, is that you ask people about their future learning. When you look at Denmark, Sweden, that is as close as I can get to Norway, you can see actually the vast majority of people say, yeah, there is some training, but no thank you, I don't need it. No. That's the biggest challenge of our times. We have given people a model of learning in universities and schools that they don't want to go back to. They don't think that's for them. We haven't yet figured out that people learn differently and to provide a much more differentiated way of adult learning that engages people. There are a lot of things that we can do about this. The first is, regulation. How do we balance flexibility with security? Encouraging people to move on, to learn for their next job, not to improve just for their current job. Social protection. Is it about repairing or replacing the structures that we have today? I think we need to ask ourselves those questions seriously. Social dialogue, Is it about, just upgrading, or is it about rebuilding? Social dialogue, to whom do you talk in the platform economy? It's not so simple. There's not the clear employer-employee. All of those structures require rethinking. And then over skills. Firms becoming the learning environment. Now, everybody knows that. Now, we used to learn to do the work. Now, learning is the work. But how do we actually give people ownership over what they learn, how they learn, where they learn, when they learn? How do we incentivize people to invest in their future rather than just living in the past? What are the incentives for people? Who sets the standards? Now, one of the big roadblocks to continue learning is that we are not good in recognizing the learning that happens. We still put our degrees and qualifications in our CVs. They tell us actually very little about what people know and what they can do. Now, in a country like Norway, the match between formal degrees and qualifications and actual skills is much poorer than you might think. And that's true in many countries. Who trains the trainers? Those are the questions that we need to argue. And then, what we do with people in firms is the easy part. How do we do with people who are not working? The unemployed, okay, government deals with this. But what about people who are just, at the corner of risk losing their job? The truck driver today. What are we doing with those people? Is it, the job of governments, the job of firms? How do we bring those worlds together? How do we give people more of a role? The gig economy, who invests in the people who work on their own? And we're not thinking hard enough about those questions that may be very, very important. Certifying skills. Once again, building a currency of the skills that people have today. I'm a good example. I have a very good degree in physics. I had my first job in science and so on. And I still put that in my CV. But if you put me in a laboratory today, I'm going to do a miserable job because I've lost many of the skills that I didn't use. And the world of science has moved on. Well, we are not very good in recognizing and noting those kinds of things. And I actually think there's a big role for you as employers to define that currency. You have given your universities basically a monopoly over this. They're very good in bundling three things. Content that they deliver, then they have the delivery, and they own the accreditation. So they decide what people study, how they study, and how it's certified. In a platform economy, that's no longer how we work these days. I think employers will play a very important role in the future to redefine the kind of currencies that actually value the skills of people have. And for governments, of course, the job is getting a lot tougher too. New forms of work means we haven't yet figured out how to tax those kinds of jobs. There's fewer revenue for governments. Then there is a demography, not so problematic in Norway yet, but not be surprised. You can calculate that today. The picture looks very different. Decentralized information means, governments have a harder time to tracking things. Keeping people want, on the one hand, devolution, at the same time, they want coherence, and those things are difficult to do. The link between education and jobs is getting weaker. It's a problem for you in hiring people, it's a problem for people, and so on. And then comes the policy headache. You can improve educational outcomes. If the labor market doesn't become better in extracting value from highly skilled, you're going to lose those people. Not so much an issue for Norway these days, but think about tomorrow. You can improve access to tertiary education. You have done that in Norway. But if you don't invest in the foundations, and I think that's a big risk for your country, you're going to actually have a poor impact on outcomes and supply. You can make huge investments in R&D, and I think that's a good thing. It's a very important thing to invest in your future. But if you don't have the kind of tailored educational service that actually get R&D into innovation, that connect actually good ideas with actually putting them into practice, you're not going to see the benefits out of this. It's about coordinating policies. It's about aligning policies, making consistent what we did yesterday with what we're going to do tomorrow, and what we do in early childhood education with the tertiary education. And it's raising huge governance challenge. When we did our skills review for Norway, we actually found that to be a major issue. How do you connect the dots? And this is not just connecting government kind of services. This is the easy part. It's very much about how we connect, making education and learning not just a whole of government project, but a whole of society project in which everybody is involved. Developing the relevant skills. Activating them, making sure that people who have great skills get a chance to use them. Actually, if you compare, Japan and the United States, the biggest economies in the OECD, Japan is very, very good in developing skills, but very poor in extracting value from them. Women are excluded from many occupations. The job market is very rigid, very siloed. Not so great. So productivity is just so-so, despite great skills. You go to the United States, I've just shown they're not very good in their kind of skilled supply in the talent pipeline. But nobody beats the United States in turning better skills into better jobs and better lives. No? And Norway still has a way to go on both dimensions. No? It's about efficient skilled financing. And again, thinking about who should pay for what, when and how. People, employers, government, sharing costs and benefits. I think it's something that Norway didn't have to think about because the government has a lot of money. But if you think 20, 30 years down the road, you need to ask that question much more harder than in the past. Skills learning and labor market qualifications, those are the things to really worry about. But again, I'm quite optimistic. I must say, actually, Norway has always been at the frontier of things. It's making huge investments. Society has been willing to invest in the future. And I think that's the most promising asset that you can bring to the table. Thank you very much.
Thank you.